Regardless of what type of anime you are watching at any given time, inevitably a concern or a question you're going to ask yourself before you start it, and potentially while you're in the process of watching it, is this animation quality up to snuff? It's been a frequent debate in the anime community how much animation quality should matter. Should we disregard shows because they have janky CGI? Should we disregard shows because they look older? These are problems that people face whenever they are discussing a particular show in the community. An older show, a show that looks a little bit different, a show with character designs that maybe deviate from the norm and some people might not find particularly appealing. Whether the show is a action series that has to have really amazing looking hype moments and aura, or is simply a comedy series that maybe doesn't need to have the highest animation budget, but people expect to look a certain way, to have a baseline of quality. But what exactly is that quality? How do we determine that? What does it really mean for something to look good? Does something need to be super detailed? Can it be simplistic? At the end of the day, I think what's most important is how effectively a show utilizes whatever animation quality, budget, and style it chooses to go with to the best effect. To me, Hidamari Sketch is one of the best examples of a series making use and taking advantage of seemingly a rather small animation budget, at least when it started out. When this show began in 2007, the first season definitely looks to be of lesser animation quality than other shows from that era. And sure, this is a slice of life series about characters living in a school-run apartment complex while most of them attend for its art program. It's not exactly a show that needs to have a gorgeous animation budget. And yet, despite that, one of the criticisms you'll often see levied at season 1 of this show especially is that it is rather simplistic. And whether or not that simplicity was born from a lower animation budget for season 1 because they didn't know how well the show would do, or was potentially an intentional choice, or was maybe a little bit of both, I think it ultimately shows that even if a series doesn't have the highest of budgets, if it wants to, and potentially if it's put under certain pressures and forced to innovate, it can turn out to be a very beautiful series in its own right. From the get-go with Hidamari Sketch, you will be thrown into environments that look rather simplistic. You will have characters that don't move a whole lot, depending on the scene. You will have just straight-up photos of real-life objects used in certain scenes. The backgrounds in this series are always, throughout the show, all the way to the end, very simplistic. This is not a show where you're going to find stunning, beautiful backgrounds. And while typically I would say, well, I want my slice of life series to have beautiful backgrounds. I want it to remind me of an iyashikei. I want it to be relaxing. I would argue despite that, despite not fully going in that direction, this show definitely achieves a level of atmosphere that almost puts it on the level of being an iyashikei. And I know many people do consider it an iyashikei. This series definitely comes close to the point where I would say it's probably iyashikei adjacent, because even though it doesn't have those super detailed backgrounds and visuals, it does nevertheless create this relaxing, calming atmosphere, despite the fact that most of the show takes place in the various, mostly similar looking apartment rooms in this complex. And these aren't super detailed apartments. These are basically a bedroom, small bathroom, and a kitchen. That's it. These are small, these are tiny, and yet, through the simplicity of the show's animation, especially starting out, and perhaps because of it, in fact, the show is able to make you at home in this environment, in this small apartment. Despite the fact that it's not necessarily the most detailed, despite the fact that it might use realistic images of things from time to time, despite the fact that it doesn't have those crazy, amazing looking backgrounds, it still makes you feel cozy. And at the end of the day, when I watched this series a few summers back, that's what I needed above all else. I needed something that was relaxing and cozy and made me feel warm inside. Even though, yes, a lot of the decisions this show made in terms of its structure, in terms of its setting, in terms of its directing, was based on the constraints of a smaller animation budget, I believe those constraints allowed this show to flourish, allowed it to really make what shouldn't be a super memorable locale, this apartment complex with all these rooms that look basically the same with a few differences depending on the character's personal touches, into a really memorable and distinctive setting in my mind. I should not think back on any of these characters' rooms as memorable. I should not think back on them as special. And yet I do, because this show, despite the constraints it was placed under, was able to nevertheless direct these scenes and handle these characters in a way that made these locations feel warm. And that is something that, for me at least, you typically would need a lot of detailed backgrounds and scenery and locations to do. This show achieved something through its simplicity that most shows would never be able to pull off. And so despite season 1 on the surface, maybe not looking as amazing as other shows from this era, or even other slice of life shows from this era, I think the show being put in a situation where it seemingly did not have this super amazing animation budget forced it to innovate in a way that helped define the very core of the Hidamari Sketch anime and what it ended up becoming. As the show transitioned into future seasons, you can tell the animation budget definitely increased. That Shaft either had more confidence in this series, or it sold better than they thought, or whatever, because not just in the show itself, but in the openings and endings especially, you can tell they had more money to spend. If you watch opening 1 versus opening 2, you can tell there's a lot more being put into this opening. And if you look at some of the endings, you can tell that if they really wanted to, they could have put in really detailed, really amazing looking backgrounds. The ending to season 4 especially really stands out in my mind as, oh wow, they could have done this if they wanted to. And yeah, by season 4, I think they definitely could have. But because the show's identity was so intertwined with that simplicity, because of how season 1 was forced to design itself, it wouldn't really have felt like the same show had they done that. As much as a part of me would have loved to have those visuals in the background, at the same time, it would have gone against the show's identity at that point. When so much of the show is set in this apartment complex, and you're not looking out the window to see these amazing visuals, you're not looking out the window to see this super detailed environment, it ends up actually making the world feel smaller. And on the one hand, you could argue, well, I don't want the world to feel small, I want it to feel big. But in a show whose primary goal is to make you feel cozy, to make you feel warm, to calm you down, and ultimately make you happy by just spending time with these characters and their various slice of life shenanigans to help distract you from the stresses of real life. Honestly, making the world feel smaller, making it feel like a world just doesn't exist outside the walls of this apartment, it actually makes the show feel more cozy, as though anything and everything exists within this one space. So if the show had decided, once it had a higher budget, to add all these backgrounds and increase scenery to the show, it would have changed the very nature of what Hidamari Sketch had defined itself to be. I think they did the right thing by keeping the show rooted in the simplicity that it was forced to embrace and make use of all the way back in season 1. One thing that does change as the seasons progress is the character designs. It's the sort of thing that I didn't even initially realize when I first watched the series. Season 1 definitely has the most simplistic character designs, and as the series goes on, you see an increased focus on their movements, on how they look. To the point where, yes, by season 3 and season 4 especially, I think most people would say the character designs look good, look well animated. In fact, they almost look like Madoka characters, which I guess isn't surprising because it's done by the same studio and done around the same time as Madoka Magica. But it does make looking back at the older seasons perhaps a little bit difficult once you realize what the character designs become. Season 2 especially has this sort of puffiness to the characters' faces that is really only present in season 2, and then as we go to season 3 and season 4, that puffiness goes away. And I know there are people who really do not like how that looks, despite the fact that season 2, in terms of episode quality, might be the best season, or it certainly is amongst one of the best seasons of the show. So ironically, even though as the show went on, it still sort of kept to its roots when designing the world and the atmosphere of the show, you can tell they did use that budget for something, and that mainly was, in addition to the openings and the endings, improving the movements of the characters and adding to the character designs. Whether or not that will bother you is going to be entirely a personal concern. Ultimately, I think everybody's going to have a particular style of character design that they're going to gravitate towards more. Just know that if you don't particularly like some aspect of the character designs in one season, they're going to look a little bit different in the next one. This is primarily a episodic slice of life series, one that, for whatever reason, decided it wanted to present itself in a non-chronological order, at least at first. And this isn't the sort of thing where you can just easily put the episodes in a chronological order and watch it that way, because this series has multiple stories in each episode, usually 2, maybe more, and those stories are not going to be presented chronologically themselves. You might have an episode start off in November, and then the second part goes all the way back to May, and then the next episode starts in the following January, and then the second half goes all the way back to July. It would be a massive undertaking to try to watch this show in chronological order, because you're not just putting episodes in order, you're putting parts of episodes in order. And then when you get to season 3, it still follows that structure, but in that situation, you have a first half that's mostly in chronological order in modern day, and a second half that's going back to the previous year. So how do you handle that? I would argue, even if you're someone who's worried about chronological order, don't bother. This is not a series where that's super relevant. It's not a super plot-focused show. And as it goes on, that starts to go away anyway, and the show generally keeps to a linear format for the most part. Try and take advantage of the fact that, yes, you're going to know certain events in advance, so you can look forward to them happening. If the characters reference something in episode 4 that maybe doesn't happen until the end of the season, that's kind of neat to be able to say, I know something that's going to happen, and you can kind of speculate on what that's going to be. Just kind of accept it and don't worry too much about it. But getting back to the characters, I do think all of them have their own charm in their own way. The main character is, I would argue, the heart and soul of the show, because at the end of every episode, we get her thoughts on what has happened, her perspective. We start with her and we end with her. This is very much so her journey through school, her trying to understand herself, learn what she wants to do, and ultimately try to accept a role of responsibility. Because when the show starts, she is very much so looking up to the older girls in the apartment complex, to Hiro and Sae. And as the show goes on, she increasingly realizes, hey, now there are people younger than me here, and eventually Hiro and Sae are going to graduate. I'm going to be the oldest person here, and the only other person my age is Mia, and I probably can't rely on her all that much. I need to take on that role of responsibility, and that's something that does bother her, and as the show goes on, she has to wrestle with that. Unfortunately, because the show ends where it does, we don't actually get to see Yuno in that position, because the show stops with Hiro and Sae's graduation. And while I can see why Shaft chose to do that, simply because it is a good stopping point, to the point where I think that there are probably a lot of people out there who don't realize that the story of Hidamari Sketch is not done. That the source material not only goes well beyond what the anime covers, but it's still ongoing to this day, because that stopping point feels so natural. Until you realize this is supposed to be Yuno's story, we don't even get to see her third year. We don't get to see her have to actually step into that role of being the responsible one, looking out for everybody younger than her. And that is kind of a disappointment. I'm not entirely sure why Shaft decided not to make any more. I mean, it's been 12 years at this point. I would love for them to make another season, but seemingly they decided to move on from it. And I do think that's a shame, because Yuno as a character, I think, should have gotten to that point in her life. I think we should have gotten to see that in animated form. That doesn't take away from her character, because you can certainly still see that growth begin, see her heading in that direction of realizing, I have to be more responsible, I have to deal with this, I have to look out for everybody younger than me staying at the apartments. I just wish we could have actually seen her in that position and not just thinking about it and worrying about it. The other characters all have their own memorable charms to them, whether it be Hiro's warmness, Sae's work as a mangaka and her own concerns with that, and awkwardness relating to other subjects that she pretends to be rather knowledgeable about, Miyako's chaotic factor, Nori being the straight man of the group, and Nazuna being the shy one who ultimately has to deal with quite a lot when you think about it. The fact that all of a sudden she's forced to stay at these apartments because her parents are moving away, and yet she's already accepted to the school. It's kind of a weird situation that I'm not sure the show spends as much time on as they should in terms of analyzing her character, but each of them has their charm, and each of them is memorable in their own way. But at the end of the day, Yuno is the heart and soul of this show. So while I am disappointed that we don't see a completion to her character arc, which I guess we still couldn't anyway because the source material isn't over, I am still happy with what we got here. And I'm happy the show at least ends on a good note, a satisfying enough stopping point when it very easily could have just stopped abruptly. As far as endings go, things definitely could have been a lot worse for this series. So ultimately, Hidamari Sketch ended up taking a situation where it clearly did not have as much animation budget as it probably wanted and turned that into a core tenet of its identity. This show would not have been the same if it had that higher animation budget from the get-go. It would have felt different. And that identity, that simplicity, that beauty from this sort of smaller, cozy world that it focuses on, this warmth from all of these characters spending time together, whether they're playing a board game that they made up or trying to cook or just watching something on TV or clipping toenails or whatever, their interactions in these apartments are not just memorable, but heartwarming. Watching this show and being able to relax to it every night was such a joy when I watched it a few years ago. And it's a joy that I hope other people will experience. This show is very much so more than meets the eye. And I think it goes to show that not every series needs to have what is conventionally seen as a high animation budget. Quality is in the eye of the beholder. And even when you're placed under constraints, you can take what is seemingly a bad hand and turn it into a core facet of one's identity. Hidamari Sketch is the very definition of finding beauty in simplicity. Thank you so much for watching. Like and subscribe if you enjoyed. And until next time, take care, everyone. Look forward to the next video.